The hum of the fluorescent lights in my office was a familiar lullaby, a constant companion to the endless dance of digits on my screen. Grant, that's me, forensic accountant. Some people see numbers as cold, sterile things. I see them as stories, whispers of intent, sometimes even shouts of deception. My job is to listen. This latest assignment landed on my desk like a perfectly balanced ledger. A straightforward corporate fraud case. A mid-level executive at Sterling Corp, a man named Davies, was suspected of skimming profits. Petty cash mostly, or so it seemed. A simple audit, a few interviews, and I'd have my report. My usual routine, the kind that usually leads to a quiet evening with a book and a single malt. I leaned back in my worn leather chair, the springs groaning a protest. Sterling Corp, they dealt in. Well, it wasn't my area of expertise. Logistics, I think. Big shipping containers, warehouses, that sort of thing. Not my usual bailiwick of tech startups or real estate moguls, but the numbers were numbers, and they all spoke the same language to me. My fingers, calloused from years of tapping keyboards and sifting through documents, hovered over the mouse. I clicked open the initial spreadsheets, a familiar ritual. The crisp lines, the neatly aligned columns, it was a language I understood implicitly. I traced the flow of funds, looking for the anomalies, the stray decimal points, the transactions that didn't quite square. Davies. His name appeared with an almost unnerving regularity in the expense reports, always for oddly specific, non-reimbursable items. $1,000 here for client entertainment, another $1,500 there for travel incidentals. Nothing egregious, but the pattern was persistent. Like a tiny, irritating itch I can't quite scratch. I pulled up Davies' personal financial statements, cross-referencing them with his company accounts. The discrepancy was subtle, almost imperceptible. A few $1,000s a month siphoned off. Enough to keep him comfortable, perhaps, but hardly enough to warrant the kind of attention this was getting. Sterling Corp had engaged my services with an urgency that felt a little disproportionate to the alleged crime. "We need this handled quietly, Mr. Grant," the general counsel had said, his voice tight with a forced calm. "Discretion is paramount." That's when the first real flicker of unease ignited in my gut. Why the hush-hush for such a relatively small sum? Unless it wasn't just about the money. My mind, ever trained to connect disparate pieces, started to churn. What if Davies wasn't the sole architect of this scheme? What if he was just a pawn, a convenient scapegoat? My gaze drifted to a framed photograph on my desk. A younger me standing beside a woman whose smile could outshine any sunrise. The edges of the photo were frayed, a testament to how long it had been tucked away, a silent reminder of a life that felt. Before, it was that emptiness, that quiet ache that often propelled me forward, pushing me to find order in chaos, truth in the tangled mess of financial records. I decided to dig deeper. I requested Davies' phone records, his email archives. The initial request was met with a curious hesitation from Sterling Corp's IT department, another tiny red flag I logged mentally. When the data finally arrived, it was a deluge. Thousands of emails, hundreds of calls. I spent the next few days immersed, the hum of the office fading into the background as I navigated the digital labyrinth. Davies' communications were mostly mundane, work-related chatter, but scattered amongst them were cryptic messages, brief exchanges with an anonymous email address. "The package is ready. Confirmation received. Proceed as planned." The language was vague, almost like coded instructions. My unease grew. This was far beyond simple embezzlement. Then a name popped up in his call logs with alarming frequency. Dr. Thorne. No company affiliation, just a name. I searched public records, but nothing immediately linked a doctor. Thorne to Sterling Corp or Davies. It was a dead end, or so it seemed. The next morning my phone rang. It was the general counsel, his voice now laced with a raw panic I hadn't heard before. "Grant," he stammered, "we have a situation, Davies. He's dead." My breath caught. Dead. My mind flashed back to the expense reports, the cryptic emails. "How?" I managed to ask, my voice unnaturally steady. "An accident, they are saying, fell, but there's a request. An emergency autopsy. In the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested." He paused, his breathing ragged. "They want you there to observe, to ensure everything is by the book, given the circumstances." The hospital basement, emergency autopsy. The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. My quiet routine was shattered, and I had a sinking feeling that the story they were telling was about to become a tragedy. The air in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, was thick with the cloying scent of disinfectant and something else. Something metallic and sour that I'd learned to associate with tragedy. It clung to the back of my throat. I adjusted my tie, a futile attempt to maintain some semblance of professional decorum in a place that felt anything but. The detective, a broad-shouldered man whose suit looked perpetually rumpled, gestured with a gloved hand towards a stainless steel table. "This is where we found him, Grant. Or rather, where they found him." My gaze swept over the sterile environment. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh, unflattering glow. The room was sparsely furnished, a few metal cabinets, a sink, and the table. On the table lay a sheet stark white against the dull metal. Beneath it, a shape that was undeniably human, yet profoundly still. The preliminary report said a business associate. The detective continued, his voice low. "Said he'd gone missing a few days ago. Neighbor called it in. Said the door was ajar." I swallowed, the metallic tang in the air suddenly sharper. This wasn't just a missing person anymore. This was the consequence of numbers gone wrong, but in a way I'd never encountered. My usual work involved tracing illicit financial flows, uncovering shell corporations, and deciphering convoluted balance sheets. This was a different kind of ledger, one written in blood. "And you think this is connected to the Sterling Investments audit?" I asked, my voice a little rougher than I intended. The fraud case I'd been working on for Sterling, a labyrinth of offshore accounts and suspiciously timed transactions, had led me to a dead end just yesterday. A dead end that had apparently led someone else to this. The detective nodded, his expression grim. "The associate's name is Arthur Finch, Sterling Investments. He was one of your key contacts, wasn't he? The one you said was being difficult." Difficult, that was putting it mildly. Finch had been evasive, contradictory, and downright hostile when I'd pressed him about certain transactions. He'd stonewalled me at every turn, a brick wall of carefully constructed obfuscation. Now I understood why. He wasn't just protecting Sterling, he was protecting himself. He was, I confirmed, the words feeling heavy. He had access to everything, all the sensitive documentation. My mind raced, replaying our last few interactions. Finch's nervous glances, the way he'd cleared his throat before answering even the simplest question. I chalked it up to corporate anxiety, the pressure of being scrutinized. Now I saw it as fear, real, palpable fear. "We haven't touched anything significant yet," the detective said, indicating the sheet. "The medical examiner is on their way. They'll do the full autopsy, but from what the first responders saw, it wasn't natural causes." I stepped closer to the table, my professional curiosity warring with a growing unease. I wasn't a detective. I didn't deal with crime scenes. My domain was spreadsheets, not this, yet the numbers had led me here. The financial irregularities at Sterling Investments had pointed a finger, and now that finger had been followed by a body. What? What exactly did they see? I asked, my gaze fixed on the outline beneath the sheet. The detective hesitated, then sighed. "A puncture wound, deep, and signs of a struggle, not a lot, but enough. He didn't go down easy." He paused, his eyes meeting mine, and they found this clutched in his hand. He reached into a small evidence bag he was holding and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. It was intricately carved, depicting a coiled serpent. I recognized it instantly. It was identical to one I'd seen on Finch's desk, a personal trinket he'd kept tucked away in a drawer. He was holding onto it, the detective stated, like it was important or like he was trying to hide it. My stomach churned. This was no longer just about a fraudulent accounting scheme. This was about a man's life and his violent end. The fraud was a symptom, and this murder was the disease. And I, Grant, the forensic accountant, had somehow stumbled into the heart of it. I thought back to the Sterling Investments file on my desk, the stacks of paper that now felt charged with a new, sinister energy. The shell corporations, the offshore accounts, the shell companies within shell companies, it was all a facade. And Arthur Finch, the man who'd held so many of the keys, had paid the ultimate price for knowing too much or for trying to keep something hidden. "Did he say anything?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Before this, detective shook his head. "Not that we know of, but if he did, maybe it was related to this." He gestured to the locket. I looked at the serpent, its scales rendered in exquisite detail, a tiny, deadly coil. It was a symbol of deception, of hidden danger. It was the perfect emblem for the rot I'd been uncovering. "I need to see the full audit report again," I said, the words coming out with a newfound urgency. "And all my notes from my meetings with Finch. Everything. This changes everything." My professional detachment was gone, replaced by a cold, hard knot of determination. The numbers hadn't just been screaming, they'd been shouting a warning, and now I had to listen. I had to understand what Arthur Finch had known and why it had gotten him killed. The Sterling Investments case was no longer just a job. It was a pursuit of justice, and I was the only one who had been close enough to the numbers to see the truth before it was buried with a man. The air in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, hung thick and sterile, a stark contrast to the gritty reality of Arthur Finch's demise. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pallid glow on the tiled floor and the stainless steel table. I stood by the entrance, a folder clutched tight in my hand, watching the medical examiner work with a practiced, almost detached efficiency. This wasn't my usual stomping ground. My world was one of spreadsheets and balance sheets, of tracing phantom transactions through labyrinthine corporate structures. But Arthur Finch's death, a brutal punctuation mark at the end of a financial anomaly, had dragged me into this. The official report called it a robbery gone wrong, a random act of violence. But the numbers, those silent, eloquent witnesses, had told me a different story. They'd whispered of something far more calculated, something Arthur had stumbled upon and that had ultimately cost him his life. My gut, usually a reliable compass in the murky waters of financial fraud, was screaming that this was no random act. The medical examiner, a woman with tired eyes and an unnervingly steady hand, looked up from him work. "You're Grant, right? The accountant." Her voice was raspy, a low murmur in the cavernous space. I nodded, stepping further into the room. Yes, I needed to see him to understand. My voice felt a little too loud, a little too shaky. She gestured with a gloved hand towards the slab. Not much to see now, they did a thorough job. Her tone was matter-of-fact, devoid of emotion. It was a professional shield, I knew, but it still sent a shiver down my spine. This was a man, not just a collection of data points. I approached the table, my gaze sweeping over Arthur. The bandages, the sterile sheets. It was a grim tableau, but even in this state, I felt a strange sense of connection. Arthur Finch, the quiet, meticulous analyst at Sterling Investments, had been my unwitting guide into this darkness. The discrepancy I'd found in his personal accounts, a series of small, regular transfers to an offshore entity, had been the first thread. Pulling it had unraveled more than I ever anticipated. The police said, "Robbery." I ventured, my eyes fixed on Arthur's still face. The medical examiner shrugged. "That's what the preliminary suggests, but you're here because you think otherwise, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. She'd seen enough to know when something felt off. "The financial records I reviewed," I began, my mind already sifting through the data, "they showed irregularities. Arthur was digging into something significant. I thought of the encrypted files on his personal drive, the ones he'd apparently tried to scrub before. I'd managed to recover a fraction of them, enough to see the outline of a much larger operation than simple corporate embezzlement." She paused, her scalpel hovering. "Significant enough to get killed over?" "I'm starting to believe so," I admitted, the knot in my stomach tightening. This was no longer just about uncovering fraud. This was about justice for Arthur. Leaving the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The official investigation was a dead end, a convenient narrative to close the books. My investigation, however, had just begun. Back in my sterile office, the glow of my monitor felt like a beacon. I opened the recovered files, the fragmented data a puzzle waiting to be solved. The shell corporations Arthur had been investigating were a dizzying array. Names like Apex Holdings, Horizon Ventures, and Nightingale Group flashed across my screen. They were ghosts, existing only on paper, their registered addresses leading to mail drops or virtual offices. But the money flowed. Through them, vast sums were being siphoned, disguised as legitimate investments and consultancy fees, and the beneficiaries were as elusive as the companies themselves. I spent the next few hours diving deep, cross-referencing company registries, tracing the paper trails. It was painstaking work, a digital excavation. Arthur had been meticulous, leaving breadcrumbs even in his attempts to cover his tracks. He'd used a secure messaging app, encrypted emails, and a complex system of proxy servers. He'd been terrified, and he'd been smart. Then I found it. A recurring pattern of payments, originating from one of the shell corporations, funneling into an account linked indirectly to a prominent real estate developer. The amounts were small enough to go unnoticed in the larger scheme, but their consistency was telling, and the dates. They coincided with major political donations made by the developer's company. This wasn't just about money laundering. This was about influence. Arthur hadn't just found a fraud, he'd stumbled upon a mechanism for manipulating power. My phone buzzed, startling me. It was a colleague, a fellow forensic accountant at Sterling, asking about my progress on the Sterling Investments case. I hesitated, then typed a carefully worded reply, downplaying my findings. I couldn't trust anyone yet, not until I knew who was truly pulling the strings. The web Arthur had uncovered was far more intricate and far more dangerous than I had initially imagined, and I was now caught in its silken threads. The stale air of the hospital basement clung to me, thick with the metallic tang of disinfectant and something else, something less sterile, more Final. The emergency autopsy requested for Arthur was a grim necessity, a stark reminder of how quickly numbers could turn deadly. I'd left the sterile chill of the autopsy suite behind, but the weight of what I'd seen, the meticulous, almost surgical precision of the injuries, settled heavy in my gut. The official investigation, as I'd told the detective, felt like a carefully constructed facade, a dead end designed to keep us all looking in the wrong direction. My car felt like a sanctuary, a small bubble of normalcy as I navigated the late afternoon traffic. The city lights blurred into streaks of color, each one a reminder of the lives being lived, oblivious to the rot I was digging into. I replayed the conversation with the detective in my head, his polite dismissal, the subtle shift in his eyes when I'd mentioned the inconsistencies in Arthur's final financial reports. He was playing a part, and I just stumbled onto his stage. My phone buzzed, jolting me, a text from a burner number I'd been using for discreet communication. "They know you're looking." A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning snaked up my spine. Who were they? The company. The implications were terrifying, but also strangely validating. If they were this worried, I was on the right track. I pulled over into a dimly lit parking lot, the gravel crunching under my tires. I needed to think, and I needed a plan. Rushing in blind was how Arthur had ended up in the hospital basement. My usual method, spreadsheets, audits, following the money trail, felt insufficient now. This was a different kind of ledger, written in blood and veiled threats. I thought about the junior analyst I'd spoken to earlier in the week, the one who'd stammered through his answers about the offshore accounts. He'd seemed genuinely terrified, not just of losing his job, but of something far more profound. He'd mentioned Arthur had been meeting with someone outside of regular business hours, someone who didn't leave a paper trail. A ghost. The ghost. That was the missing piece. Arthur wasn't just cooking the books, he was being coerced, or perhaps he was playing a deeper, more dangerous game than I'd initially understood. A sudden movement in my peripheral vision made me flinch. Coincidence? My gut screamed no. I started the engine, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. I needed a new angle, a new source. Someone on the inside, someone who wasn't afraid. My thoughts drifted to the retired security guard I'd met at Arthur's apartment building. Old Mr. Henderson. He'd been a font of gossip, complaining about the constant stream of late-night visitors and the hushed, urgent conversations he'd overheard. He'd also mentioned seeing a specific, unmarked van parked in the alley behind the building several times in the past month, always late at night. He dismissed it as nothing at the time, just another part of the city's nocturnal rhythm. But now, I drove towards Arthur's old neighborhood, the familiar streets feeling alien and threatening. The detective's polite stonewalling, the burner phone text, the idling sedan, it was a symphony of intimidation. They wanted me to back off. I found Mr. Henderson sitting on his usual bench, feeding pigeons. He looked up as I approached, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Grant, my boy, back for another look." "Mr. Henderson," I began, keeping my voice low. "I need my help. It's about Arthur." He nodded, his gaze growing serious. "Terrible business, such a nice man." "I mentioned seeing a van in the alley," I asked, cutting to the chase. "An unmarked one," his brow furrowed. "Aye, fancy it was, clean as a whistle. Despite being in the alley, always late, saw it a few times." "Did I happen to catch any part of the license plate?" I pressed, my pulse quickening. This was it, a tangible lead. He shook his head slowly. No, and I wasn't exactly taking notes, I understand." He chuckled, but there was a hint of unease in his eyes. "But I did see something else now that I mention it." I leaned closer. He had a tattoo on his wrist, a coiled snake. Always thought it was a bit dramatic. A coiled snake. It was a small detail, almost insignificant, but in the context of Arthur's murder and the financial labyrinth I was navigating, it felt like a beacon. It was the kind of detail that didn't belong in a clean corporate fraud case. It belonged in something far grittier. As I thanked Mr. Henderson and walked back to my car, the idling sedan was gone, but the feeling of being watched hadn't dissipated. The coiled snake. I'd seen that symbol before, a subtle emblem on the letterhead of a shell corporation Arthur had been funneling money through. A company that officially dealt in logistics and transport. Logistics and transport, the unmarked van. The pieces were starting to click into place, forming a picture far more disturbing than I'd anticipated. This wasn't just about fraud. It was about a network, a clandestine operation using Arthur's company as a front. And Arthur, it seemed, had gotten too close to the truth, or perhaps had tried to break free. I started the engine, the gravel spitting as I pulled away. I was no longer just an accountant. The fluorescent lights of the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, hummed a low, discordant tune, a stark contrast to the sterile quiet I usually associated with such places. It wasn't my usual haunt, not by a long shot. My world was spreadsheets and balance sheets, not the cold, metallic gleam of surgical instruments and the faint, cloying scent of disinfectant. But Arthur's case had taken a sharp turn, and the little coiled snake I'd found tucked away in his office files had led me here. A colleague, a sharp-eyed woman who usually dealt with the more physical aspects of evidence, met me at the entrance to the autopsy suite. Her expression was grim, the kind that suggested she'd seen too much and was bracing herself for more. "Grant," he said, his voice low, "they're almost done." The coroner agreed to a preliminary look, said it was unusual. Unusual, that word had become my constant companion since Arthur's death. He was supposed to be a simple case of embezzlement, a disgruntled executive siphoning funds, but the snake and now this. This felt like a different beast entirely. We stepped into the room. The air was colder, heavier. The body lay on a steel table, draped in a sheet. The coroner, a man whose face seemed etched with perpetual weariness, was meticulously documenting his findings. He nodded at me, his eyes flicking to the colleague. "I said I wanted a preliminary assessment on the financial fraud angle, Mr. Grant." I cleared my throat, trying to project a confidence I didn't entirely feel. "Yes, specifically anything that might seem out of place beyond the obvious financial discrepancies. Anything. Symbolic, perhaps." It sounded ridiculous even to my own ears, but the snake had felt like a symbol. The coroner paused, then gestured to a small, sealed evidence bag on a nearby tray. "We found this, tucked into the lining of his jacket pocket." He carefully lifted the bag. It was identical to the one in the sketch I'd seen in Arthur's files. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was a message. But who was sending it, and to whom? "Beyond that," the coroner continued, his gaze returning to the body, "there are a few anomalies. The cause of death is consistent with blunt force trauma, but the pattern of the injuries, it's precise, almost surgical, and there are traces of a substance under his fingernails. We're running tests, but preliminary analysis suggests it's not common, highly refined, almost pharmaceutical grade, but not something I'd find in a typical medicine cabinet." Pharmaceutical grade, that sent a shiver down my spine. Arthur wasn't involved in anything like that. He was a financier. This was a leap from corporate malfeasance to, what? A drug cartel, an assassination. The colleague nudged me gently. "Look at this, Grant." He pointed to a faint, almost invisible mark on Arthur's wrist beneath the cuff of his shirt. It looked like a small, stylized knot. The coroner said he's seen something similar on other cases, ones that were officially ruled as accidents or suicides, but they always felt off. He never connected it to anything specific, though. A knot, another symbol, the snake, the knot. They were weaving a narrative I couldn't yet decipher, but the threads were undeniably sinister. This wasn't about stolen money anymore. This was about silencing someone, and the method was far more elaborate than a simple beating. "Did he have any identifying marks on him?" I asked, my mind racing. "Anything that might indicate affiliation." The coroner shook his head. "Nothing obvious. No tattoos, no unique jewelry beyond the obvious, but this." He tapped the evidence bag with the wooden snake. "This suggests a deliberate communication. Someone wanted us to find this, or perhaps someone wanted Arthur to be found with it." As we left the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, the weight of the information pressed down on me. The financial records I'd been poring over suddenly felt like a smokescreen, a carefully constructed facade to hide something far more dangerous. Arthur hadn't just stumbled upon a hidden offshore account. He'd unearthed a secret someone was willing to kill for. Back in my car, the city lights blurred as I drove, my thoughts a tangled mess. The colleague had gone back to her lab, but I couldn't shake the image of the wooden snake, the precise nature of Arthur's injuries, and that strange knot on his wrist. I pulled over to the side of the road, the engine idling. I opened Arthur's file, flipping through the scanned documents. The numbers swam before my eyes. They didn't make sense anymore. They were a distraction. I remembered Arthur's assistant, a nervous young man who'd seemed terrified to even speak to me. He'd mentioned Arthur receiving strange packages, unmarked boxes, a few weeks before his death. He dismissed it as Arthur's eccentricities, but now it felt significant. And the mention of a special project Arthur had been working on, something that kept him working late, something he'd been unusually secretive about. My phone buzzed. It was a text from the colleague. "Lab confirmed. The substance under his nails is a potent neurotoxin, highly unstable, extremely difficult to synthesize, and incredibly lethal." Neurotoxin. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. This wasn't just murder. It was an execution, and the symbols, the snake, the knot, they weren't just random details. They were a signature, a warning. I leaned my head back against the headrest, a knot forming in my own stomach, far more primal than the one on Arthur's wrist. I was no longer investigating a simple fraud case. I was in the middle of something far bigger, something that involved sophisticated weaponry and deadly secrets. The numbers had led me here, but now, the real investigation had just begun and the stakes had just skyrocketed. I was no longer just digging into Arthur's past. I was staring into a very present danger. The sterile chill of the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, seeped through my thin jacket. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the rise and fall of the medical examiner's chest. Miller stood beside me, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the stillness of the body on the gurney. The snake and knot symbols, now stark against pale skin, felt less like a puzzle and more like a threat aimed directly at us. Neurotoxin, the medical examiner had confirmed, his voice a low murmur. Fast-acting, no trace in a standard panel. They knew what they were doing. I'd nodded, my mind racing. This wasn't some disgruntled employee settling a score. This was calculated professional. The victims, the whistleblower, the analyst, and now this man, the one who'd supposedly tried to blow the whistle on the data manipulation. They were all connected. And the connection wasn't just the fraudulent accounts I'd been sifting through. It was something far more lethal. Miller nudged my arm. Anything? I shook my head, chewing on the inside of my cheek. Just patterns, too neat, too clean, like a professional cleaning up loose ends. My eyes drifted to the spreadsheet on my laptop, still open from my hurried arrival. The numbers were a blur, but the anomaly I'd found yesterday, the one that had sent me scrambling to this god-forsaken place, was still etched in my mind. A series of offshore transfers, disguised as legitimate business expenses, all funneling into a single, untraceable account. An account that hadn't existed on any official ledger until 6 months ago. The money trail, Miller said, echoing my thoughts. It always leads somewhere. But this somewhere is a ghost, I replied, running a hand through my hair. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and faintly coppery that I recognized from countless crime scenes. And whoever's behind it is good. The city outside was a symphony of sirens and distant traffic, a stark contrast to the hushed intensity of the morgue. Miller had a lead on the offshore account, a preliminary trace through some old contacts. It was a long shot, but it was all we had. I kept replaying the analyst's frantic voicemail, the hushed tones, the fear. They're watching me, Grant. They know I found it, the real ledger. The real ledger, that was it. The numbers I'd been looking at were a smokescreen, a meticulously crafted illusion. The true story, the one that led to murder, was hidden somewhere else. Miller's phone buzzed, breaking the tension. He glanced at it, his expression hardening. It's my contact, he says. He says they're onto us. My gut clenched. Who's they? He didn't say, just that my inquiries about the offshore account tripped some kind of silent alarm. Someone's asking questions, questions about me asking questions. He tapped his steering wheel, a nervous energy radiating from him. And apparently they've been asking about I too, Grant, specifically my recent financial deep dives. This wasn't just corporate malfeasance anymore. This was a hunt, and we were the prey. We need to move, I said, my voice low and urgent. If they know we're close, they'll try to stop us, permanently. Miller nodded, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror. I've got a place, old warehouse on the docks. Nobody goes there anymore. Every passing car, every flicker of headlights in my peripheral vision felt like a threat. The warehouse loomed out of the gloom, a hulking, derelict structure against the Inkai sky. The air here tasted of salt and decay. Inside, dust motes danced in the weak beams of our flashlights. The vast space echoed with our footsteps. The offshore account details were still on display, a tangled mess of shell corporations and nominee directors. This account, I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard, it's not just a holding place, it's a conduit. Money's moving through it, but it's not just staying there. It's being laundered, disguised, and then sent out again. But to where? Miller was poring over a stack of old manifests he'd found. These ships, they dock here regularly, big cargo, imported and exported, anything out of the ordinary. I zoomed in on a series of transactions, cross-referencing them with shipping logs. My breath hitched. There it was, a consistent flow of funds timed perfectly with specific cargo shipments. Not just any cargo, but shipments of industrial chemicals, the kind that could be used to produce a highly potent neurotoxin. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. The fraud wasn't just about money, it was a cover for something far more dangerous. The whistleblower, the analyst, the dead man they'd stumbled onto a clandestine operation, a deadly trade hidden in plain sight, and the symbols, they weren't just a signature. They were a message, a warning to anyone who dared to look too closely. Suddenly, a scraping sound echoed from the far end of the warehouse. Both Miller and I froze, our flashlights snapping towards the noise, then another and another. They were closing in. They found us, Miller breathed, his hand instinctively going to his side. I slammed my laptop shut, my mind racing. We were trapped. And the truth, the dangerous, deadly truth, was still locked away in my head and on that encrypted drive. The game had just escalated, and the stakes were now life and death. The air in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, was thick with the metallic tang of disinfectant and something else, something coppery and unsettling. I'd never been in a place like this before, not for real. The sterile white walls seemed to press in, amplifying the low hum of unseen machinery. My flashlight beam cut through the dimness, dancing over stainless steel tables and an array of instruments that made my stomach clench. The detective stood over a body, his face grim. This wasn't the victim from the office building, not the one the initial reports pointed to. This was someone new, someone the preliminary fraud case had conveniently overlooked. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive silence. It was the timing that had brought me here, the peculiar pattern of offshore transfers I'd unearthed. They weren't just about siphoning money, they were about disposal. "You said you had something, Grant?" The detective's voice rumbled, cutting through my thoughts. He didn't look up from his grim work. "I do," I managed, my voice rougher than I intended. I held up a printout, a jumble of figures that meant everything to me and likely nothing to him at first glance. These offshore accounts, they're not just hiding profits, they're paying for something, and it's tied to the chemical shipments I flagged. He finally turned, his eyes sharp, assessing. Chemicals. What kind of chemicals? The kind that can be used to clean up messes permanently. I swallowed, the words catching in my throat. The victim on the table, a man I didn't recognize, was the ultimate mess. The fraud was just the smokescreen. The detective grunted, a sound of understanding and disgust. He gestured to a smaller table nearby, littered with vials and evidence bags. "They brought this in. The coroner's preliminary looks like a fast-acting poison. No trace," he said, except. He picked up a sealed bag containing a small, crystalline residue. He was found it on the victim's jacket collar. Looks like dust, but it's not. They're running tests, but it's slow going. I leaned closer, my forensic accounting instincts kicking in. It wasn't about the poison itself, not really. It was about the logistics of it. "The shipments," I replied, my mind racing, piecing together the fragments. They weren't just for making something. They were for transporting it, and the payments. They weren't for the chemicals themselves. They were for the services rendered, the disposal. The detective frowned. "Disposal of what, Grant? More bodies?" "Of evidence," I corrected, my gaze sweeping across the room, imagining the clandestine operations. The company wasn't just cooking the books. It was a front for whatever they needed to make disappear, and the people who got in the way, they disappeared too. My eyes fell on a small, almost imperceptible scuff mark on the polished concrete floor near one of the drainage grates. It was faint, easily missed, but to my trained eye it spoke volumes. A heavy object dragged, and the faint, almost floral scent that clung to the air, masked by the disinfectant, now registered as something more specific. It was the scent of a particular industrial solvent, one that could break down organic matter. A solvent I'd seen listed on one of the shipping manifests, disguised as a cleaning agent. "Wait," I answered, holding up a hand. "The payments, they weren't just tied to the chemical shipments. They were tied to specific shipments, ones that were diverted, not to the usual distribution centers, but to private facilities, undisclosed locations." I pulled out my tablet, my fingers flying across the screen, pulling up the complex web of transactions I'd been building. "Look here. This account, Aegis Holdings, registered in the Caymans, received a substantial sum 3 days before the first victim disappeared. And Aegis Holdings, they own a chain of industrial warehouses. One of them is near the old docks." The detective's eyes narrowed. "The docks, that's where the shipping logs showed the unusual activity." "Exactly," I confirmed, a surge of adrenaline coursing through me. It all fits. The money, the chemicals, the disappearances. They weren't just stealing from the company, they were using its resources to eliminate problems. And the man on this table, I gestured to the body. He must have found out, or maybe he was the one doing the eliminating and he got eliminated himself. A chill, unrelated to the temperature of the room, snaked down my spine. I remembered the initial report, the supposed suicide. It was too neat, too convenient. Now, I saw the strings being pulled, the careful orchestration of events to bury not just financial irregularities, but murder. "We need to go to those warehouses," I stated, my voice firm. "The ones Aegis Holdings owns, the ones that received those diverted shipments. That's where they're hiding the rest of it, the evidence, and maybe the person responsible." The detective nodded, his gaze fixed on my tablet. Aegis Holdings. I'll have my team pull everything on them. But those warehouses, they're not exactly public property. We might need a warrant, and if we go in blind. We won't, I interrupted, pointing to a specific transaction on my screen. This payment, it was made to a security firm, a private one. They're contracted to patrol those specific warehouses. I found their invoice buried deep in the subsidiary ledgers. If we can get access to their security footage, we might see who's been coming and going, and when. My mind raced, the pieces clicking into place with a terrifying finality. The fraud was the cover, the chemicals were the tools, and the disappearances, they were the true business. I looked at the detective, a grim resolve settling over me. This isn't just about fraud anymore, this is about murder, and we're going to find the proof. The hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, suddenly felt like the beginning of the end, not the end itself. The real confrontation, the real unraveling was still to come. The air in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, hung thick with the metallic tang of disinfectant and something else. Something I couldn't quite place, but which settled in my gut like a cold stone. It was the smell of finality, I supposed. The smell of secrets finally laid bare. The detective stood beside me, his usual gruff demeanor softened by a weariness that mirrored my own. We'd just come from a hushed conversation with the medical examiner, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weight of every life he'd seen pass through his sterile domain. They confirmed it. Grant, the detective said, his voice low. The victim, the one we found out at the old chemical plant. It wasn't an accident, the report. It's all there. He gestured vaguely towards a folder clutched in his hand. I didn't need to see the report. I'd seen enough. The numbers had spoken, and now the bodies were speaking too. I nodded, my gaze drifting to the stainless steel gurney in the center of the room. It was empty now, but the ghost of what had been there seemed to linger, a stark reminder of the human cost of greed and deception. The spreadsheets, the offshore accounts, the shell corporations, they had all been so abstract, so clean. But this was the brutal, messy reality behind the carefully constructed facade. My specialty was uncovering hidden truths in ledgers, in the elegant dance of debits and credits. I never imagined those truths would lead me to a place like this, to the cold, hard facts of a life extinguished. The chemicals, I murmured, the words feeling clumsy on my tongue. It wasn't about making them, was it? It was about disposing of them and anyone who got in the way. The detective let out a heavy sigh. That's the long and short of it. The company was a front. They were moving something illegal, something dangerous, and they weren't about to let anyone, least of all us or I, Grant, dig too deep. I thought back to the initial audit, the subtle discrepancies I'd flagged, the ones that had seemed almost insignificant at the time. A few missing invoices, a peculiar fluctuation in raw material costs. They were like tiny cracks in a dam, and I, in my methodical way, had kept probing until the whole thing burst. I'd been so focused on the financial sin, I'd nearly missed the much graver one. It was a humbling realization. My numerical world, so precise and ordered, had been a blindfold to a much larger, darker operation. And the missing persons cases, I added, the pieces slotting together with a sickening click. They weren't just random, they were collateral damage. The detective ran a hand over his face. That's what it looks like, people who knew too much, people who saw something they shouldn't have. They made them disappear, permanently. He paused, then looked at me, his eyes holding a flicker of something I couldn't quite read. I did good, Grant, real good. I was an accountant, not an investigator. My skill set was supposed to be confined to balance sheets and tax returns, not this. Yet here I was, standing in a morgue basement, grappling with the grim consequences of a financial crime that had spiraled into murder. It was a brutal awakening, a forceful shove out of my comfortable, ordered world. I just followed the numbers, I responded, the words sounding inadequate. They led me here. Sometimes, the detective said, his voice surprisingly gentle, that's all it takes, someone to look closer, someone to not be afraid of what they might find. He clapped a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that felt both reassuring and a little too firm. This whole operation, it's dismantled. The people responsible are in custody. Your work was the key. I looked around the sterile room again. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic, violent end the victim had met. I thought about the people who had been so easily erased, their lives reduced to a line item in a criminal enterprise. It made my own carefully constructed life feel fragile, the lines between order and chaos suddenly blurred. I'm glad it's over, I added, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. But there was a new weight to that statement. Over, yes, but not forgotten. The numbers would always tell a story, but now I knew those stories could have a far more terrifying ending than I'd ever imagined. As we walked out of the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, and back into the pale morning light, I felt a shift within me. The neat columns of figures, the predictable flow of money, they no longer held the same allure. I had seen the true cost of what lurked beneath the surface of financial statements, and it had irrevocably changed my perspective. The world of numbers was still my world, but I knew now that some digits represented more than just monetary value. They represented lives and the devastating consequences of their disruption. The case was closed, the perpetrators caught, but the echoes of this investigation would resonate within me for a long time to come.